All right, welcome everyone to the Yogic Studies podcast. This is episode 34. I'm your host, Seth Powell, and today we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Dagmar Wujastyk. I just learned the proper pronunciation of her name before we hit record. Dagmar is Associate Professor in the History, Classics, and Religion Department at the University of Alberta in Canada, and she will be teaching our upcoming course, YS 122, Yoga, Ayurveda, and Alchemy. Dagmar, welcome to the Yogic Studies podcast.
Thanks for having me, Seth.
Yes. We're very excited to have you here today to learn about your research, your teaching, a bit about your background. And we're very excited for this upcoming course. We always ask students at the end of courses, what courses would you like to see in future installments? And without a doubt, every single exit survey says Yoga and Ayurveda. We need courses on Yoga and Ayurveda. So this is something people have been asking for a long time. And I think we couldn't have found a better person, more suited to talk about not just Ayurveda, but Yoga and Ayurveda. And as we'll see today, alchemy, Indian alchemical traditions as well. So again, welcome. It's wonderful to have you here. Why don't we kick things off, though, learning a little bit about you, Dagmar. Tell us a little bit about where you are and what you do today.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm myself looking forward to this course. These are topics that I've researched for a long time. And it's really nice to get this opportunity to share my research and my thoughts on these topics. And I'm excited to hear that people have been asking for a Yoga and Ayurveda course. And I kind of hope to seduce people into Indian alchemy as well, that they will find interest in that and maybe want to learn a bit more about it. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm Associate Professor in History, Classics, and Religion at the University of Alberta. And so, the University of Alberta doesn't have a South Asian studies department, but it does have a number of South Asianists. So, for example, my husband, Dagmar Wujastyk, is also here. We have Neil Dalal, we have Patricia Soutoff, and together we all teach courses on South Asia, on the history of South Asia. And so I myself teach all sorts of courses, also in the religious department, things about Hinduism and basically Indian religions, but also on my actual topics of research, so history of Indian medicine, history of Indian alchemy, history of yoga, and so on. So that sort of part of the job is to teach, and it's quite a substantial part of the job. And then part of the job is to continue my research. And my research is particularly focused on the history of alchemy at present. And there's always a medical element, and there's always a yoga element as well. So this is something that I continue to do, sort of following on from my previous job, which was as principal investigator of a research project on yoga, Ayurveda, and alchemy at the University of Vienna. So this is sort of my day-to-day life here at the University of Alberta.
Wonderful, and we'll definitely get into the Ayuryog project here shortly. Tell us a little bit more about your background, though. How did you get into this field of work? How did you first discover Indology, the study of Sanskrit, Ayurveda, and alchemy, and so on?
Yeah, it's always a little bit difficult for me to reconstruct this because it's now quite a long time ago, right? I started studying Indology, so Indian studies, in Bonn, in Germany, in the early 90s. So I've been at this for quite a long time now. I think at the time, when I finished school, I was looking for something in the humanities, and I wanted to learn about something that I really didn't know anything about. So I really wanted to, broaden my horizons and be confronted with something that wasn't immediately recognizable to me. And so, I kind of alighted on Indian culture as something that was very foreign to me, but it could have been something else as well. It's just that when I went to the Indological seminar, I just liked the look and feel of the place, as it were. And, and I took a few terms of classes and then really kind of caught the bug, as it were, learning Sanskrit and just being confronted with this very interesting, complex culture and its history. And just went from there, really. And medicine as a sort of area of specialization, history of medicine within Indology, was something that I started for my MA, actually, for my dissertation. And I translated a 7th century work on medicine, or rather just a chapter from that work on conception and birth. And I just thought it was a very interesting area. My main professor, Klaus Vogel, had done work on this medical work. So one of his sort of areas of specialization was medicine. So it made sense for me to sort of also work in that area. And I just found it really interesting. And one of the things that was so interesting for me was, in classical Indology in Bonn, we really dealt with the past, and we mostly worked philologically. We worked with texts. I didn't have many classes, for example, that were lectures. We had reading classes. So we just read Sanskrit texts and translate. And so you have this sort of, you're in the past in your mind and you're reading texts and so on, but Ayurveda, it still has this practice that is still happening today. I knew of practitioners in India that were using these texts that I was translating. And I just thought that was really fascinating and just so interesting. And after finishing my MA, I went and visited India again, for the umpteenth time, but this time I went to Kerala and I actually visited some of these practitioners of medicine who were using the text that I had just translated for my MA. And yeah, that's really what started sort of my passion for this area of research.
Wonderful. Yeah, that must have been a special experience. Sounds like you started to go to India frequently. But what were some of your early impressions of being in India? Can you recall? And especially in those Ayurvedic contexts, stepping out of the classrooms, out of these reading rooms, out of the texts, and seeing this living tradition. Were there things that sort of surprised you about the ways in which these traditions were still alive, as you say?
Well, my visiting India predates my going for the Ayurvedic practitioners by a good decade. And I remember being quite shocked at how different modern India was to what the texts were describing. It was my first time in Asia. This was in, 94 or something like that. And it was a real adjustment. As a young woman also traveling in South Asia is not always very easy. But visiting, 10 years later, visiting the practitioners in Kerala was a delight. Well, first for their generous hospitality. There's me just sort of turning up and saying, "Oh, I hear you use those texts and your practitioners and can I stay with you and can I watch you practice?" And they were a bit perplexed, but also very welcoming. And there's nothing like Indian hospitality in my mind. And so the generosity with which they welcomed me and let me, participate in what they were doing. Yes, I had just translated this chapter on pregnancy and birth and so on. So nothing that I witnessed in Kerala had anything to do with that, right? So what I did see was they showed me their factory where they made their own medicines. And I sat in on consultations, of which I didn't understand much because they were happening in Malayalam, a language that I had not learned, I still haven't learned. So, but I could sort of just see the ways things worked. I think one of the things that surprised me was in the consultations was just how fast they were. So, how the Ayurvedic theory is really complex and diagnosis is complicated. And so I had this sort of expectation that a doctor's visit would take quite a long time, with the doctor taking a lot of time doing all the various questioning and checks and so on. And instead, a sort of typical visit seemed to take no more than 2 minutes. And in fact, the father of the family, who was the main doctor, was saying that one of the ways to recognize a really good Ayurvedic doctor would be their ability to diagnose very, very quickly. So it's very instant. Oh, I see. And then, have the solution at hand. So he would see, like 100 patients a day, easy.
Yeah.
And that was a complete surprise to me. And also, there weren't these things that we now think of in the West often of, Ayurveda, like the massages and so on. Really, most of the interventions were about him saying, right, you need this and that medicine. And very often he wouldn't actually write a prescription to go to a pharmacy to get the medicine, but would say, you can do this at home. Get this root and that root and that root, boil them together, cook them, take it 3 times a day. So that was also very interesting to me to see. And he said that they would always prefer these freshly made medicines, though some things do need something that is prepared well in advance and so on. But yeah, that was something that I found also really, really fascinating. They could show me also in their garden, in their home garden, a lot of the medicinal herbs they would be using. And the last thing that it was a sort of something I hadn't really thought about before, but when they showed me the storage room for the medicinal roots and so on, the roots all looked generally the same. I have no idea how they keep them apart, how they are able to identify them properly for making the medicines. But obviously they are able to, but that was a thing that sort of, really set me to thinking of just, this sort of identification of the materials when harvesting and later in storage, would be quite a challenge.
Mm. Well, I have so many follow-up questions to that, but I think I'm going to keep moving so that we're not here all day of just traversing your past. But clearly those experiences must have been very formational for you and inspired you to carry on and to do a PhD and then eventually to become a full professor. So as you've continued, it seems like you've continued to refine your research topics as well, of course, as we all do, but you have really stayed with these topics through your career. And this led to you developing this 5-year research project called Ayuryog, the Entangled Histories of Ayurveda, Yoga, and Alchemy. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of this project, who was on board, its scope, its aims. I think, was this from 2015 to 2020, around that time?
Yes.
So you just finished a couple years ago, although I imagine you're still probably wrapping some things up with it. But yeah, tell us about the Ayuryog project. And just for our listeners, I'm sure many of you have heard of this, but perhaps more of you were familiar with another ERC research project, the Hatha Yoga project. And this was actually going on at the exact same time. We had these 2 huge research projects within these allied fields, which was just sort of this incredible moment kind of in these Indological and yogic worlds that these were being recognized. I just wanted to say that up front. Like, this was sort of, maybe we'll look back at it as this sort of golden age of ERC funding. I don't know, but the incredible, so much has come out of this. So.
Yeah, so the ERC, the European Research Council, has actually now funded a number of sort of Indological or South Asian studies projects also after the Hatha Yoga project, after Ayuryog. But at the time, we were sort of pioneers in this. And it was wonderful that both projects got funded at the same time. And we worked together quite a lot. And in fact, it was sometimes the same people. So, for example, Jason Birch was first on my project and then moved over to the Hatha Yoga project, but kept on working with us. So some of his work really was foundational to our outcomes. So yeah, I mean, the project started. I had thought about how to to understand medicine a bit better, how to understand yoga a bit better, and in the research that I'd done before that. And I was just sort of thinking of as a practitioner of postural types of yoga myself, I'd always wondered a little bit at how how come we think of yoga as something therapeutic nowadays? Because the kind of yoga that I'd studied was, in fact, in the school of Desikachar, which is a sort of therapeutic style of yoga. But looking at Ayurvedic texts, I couldn't really see a lot of yoga in them. And this question was always open to me. Where had that happened? Where did yoga become medicine, or be considered as something you could use therapeutically? And it was always something that I wanted to follow up on. And then with this ERC project, I got the opportunity to do so. Now, myself, I had worked on Indian medicine a lot. I worked a little bit on yoga in a project with Elizabeth de Michaelis beforehand, but it wasn't really sort of my area of expertise. So it was very good for me to be able to work with a team. And so initially on my team was Jason Birch, who had this special interest in medieval yoga texts. And then also later Christelle Barrois entered the project, and she had sort of worked a lot on things to do with Puranic literature and so on. So yoga in the Puranas and other types of literature. And so she had this sort of area of expertise. And Suzanne Newcomb, who was also then on my research team, who really dealt with modern forms of yoga. She had done some research on sort of yoga in Britain beforehand for her PhD. And so she was like the ideal person to join in to talk about, you know, modern yoga and its sort of therapeutic and medical forms. So that was a really good team to sort of, you know, we could really complement each other in the things that we knew, both in terms of, you know, time, you know, some people working on the pre-modern area rather than the modern era and so on, and sort of our knowledge of the various texts and practices. And so that came together very nicely. Jason, of course, did leave the project to go over to the Hatha Yoga project. Christelle then joined. And later on in the project, I still had some money left over, basically, which was partly to do with the pandemic. We couldn't travel, and I had this massive travel budget. And actually, so I couldn't use it, but I could use it differently. And it allowed me to employ Patricia Salto, who joined sort of the last 1.5 years, almost 2 years of the project. And with her, I could do some more work on alchemy, on the alchemical aspect of things, which I had worked on my own, but now with her support, we could do a bit more work on that. So that's really how it came together. And a lot of these sort of general directions in which we went, I mean, the general brief was to see how these disciplines connected in history over time at different moments, how they mutually influenced each other, or did they influence each other? That was, you know, we couldn't assume. But, you know, the sort of various things that we found out and did were very much down to each researcher's interests and skills and abilities and so on. And so it grew quite organically from the group, I would say.
Wonderful. So did you go into this project with certain assumptions about Ayurveda, yoga, Indian alchemy, and their potential shared histories and relationships, or lack thereof? Did you have certain assumptions or even hypotheses going into the project that were either affirmed or that were challenged, or were there things that surprised you over the course of 5 years and this incredible team? And I know you had a workshop and an international conference, and so there was a very collaborative effort, and as you say, so many different areas of specialization. But were there any things that really stand out as you're, you know, now writing and wrapping and, you know, things up?
Yeah, so I had assumed, and this was confirmed, that Ayurveda and alchemy had a very deep connection. And I hadn't quite understood quite to what extent they are connected. They're very, very deeply connected. And I'll be talking about that a lot in this course that I'll be teaching. We look at some of the details of this connection. So I knew they were connected, and both in the past and now, but I hadn't quite realized quite the extent to which this was the case. When it comes to the connections between Ayurveda and yoga, my first thought was that this was a new invention, modern invention, something that happened in the 20th century, for the reason that I hadn't seen a lot of yogic material, as it were, in the pre-modern Ayurveda texts. And that continues to be true. There isn't a lot. There is some. It's not completely unconnected, not at all. Actually, you find a bit more on sort of medicine and yoga texts than on yoga in Ayurveda texts. But we did find quite a lot of instances, and you can get a bit more of a sense of a narrative there, I suppose, by just going through all the texts. You know, and when it comes to the yoga texts, you have to realize that these are texts that, you know, people hadn't really read before. We didn't have editions of them. And we now had access to these texts through the Hatha Yoga project, actually. And so we could actually see a bit more what they were about in terms of what medicine and so on they offered. And there's quite a bit of medicine in there, not necessarily Ayurveda as in the Ayurveda of the classical Sanskritic tradition. There's a lot of medicine in there, understood a little bit differently to classical Ayurveda. I think the thing that surprised me there was maybe sort of the tantric elements, and sort of tantric medicine, a whole new area of research that we weren't able to look into very deeply, but we get sort of hints of it through the kinds of names for diseases and so on, and things that are sort of described in yoga texts. And then we see this development that I had thought had happened in the 20th century, especially in the late 20th century, when yoga and Ayurveda start to be referred to as sister sciences and so on. And this is something that first happens actually in the West, with sort of teachers of Ayurveda and of yoga, people like Vasant Lad and David Frawley, sort of combining them, bringing them together. Robert Svoboda also, people teaching in the US, about these disciplines and bringing them together and then referring to them as sister sciences. And it's also picked up in India a lot now. I don't know whether through the influence of these teachers in particular, or whether it's just something that has come through the institution of the Ministry of Ayush, of the indigenous medical systems of India, which includes yoga. But now Ayurveda and yoga are, sort of officially put together in many contexts as systems for the attainment of health in India. This is a fairly recent development. So think sort of late 20th century, and now especially 21st century is something that has really gathered momentum, I would say. And it's something that maybe we can't see it so much in it's the pre-modern history of the disciplines, but it's something that makes a lot of sense when you look at how they're now combined with each other, or sort of named in the same sentence.
So to clarify, you're saying historically, when we look at the texts, we do see references to yoga in the medical and alchemical literature, and we do see some references to Indian medicine in some of the medieval yogic literature, but they're not framed as necessarily these sort of sister sciences, or with the kind of force in which it's spoken about today, that these things are really to be practiced in tandem and together, and that one would be sort of a professional aspirant sort of both. Is that sort of fair to say?
Yes, exactly. So they're really separate disciplines in history, right? You have Ayurvedic literature, you have yoga literature. They do not interact. There's a couple of exceptions, like the Ayurveda Sutra, which is all about yoga but uses Ayurvedic concepts throughout. But that's sort of an outlier. But usually they don't mention each other very much at all. So in Ayurvedic literature, we do have some important passages in one of the earliest treatises, in the Charaka Samhita, and that's more or less it. And but in yoga literature, we have a lot of mention of health and well-being and disease countering and so on. And it does use sort of Ayurvedic categories, but more in the sense of, how if I tell you I have a cold, then I'm not talking as, a biomedical practitioner. I'm just telling you I have a cold, so in that way.
There's sort of general cultural knowledge of health and well-being that draws on the kind of, the science of the day, if you will.
Exactly. Yeah, sort of the general popular knowledge of the day, I suppose. But yogis also had their own ways of countering disease. And one of these sort of most different ways of countering disease, different to the Ayurvedic tradition, is the use of breathing techniques, for example, and then later of asana, of postural practice to counter disease. So that's something that isn't really mentioned in the Ayurvedic tradition at all. And in Jason's research, he also found that some of the disease names that you find in yoga texts are not actually found in the Ayurvedic tradition, but in tantric texts, so in agamas. So it's not, you do have a lot of, a cold is a cold, you have that same name in Ayurvedic texts and then in yoga texts, but you also have some that show that there's some other tradition there, some other medical tradition or another way of thinking about medicine.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, because certainly, the earlier texts of yoga, Patanjali Yoga Shastra, earlier Puranic literature, doesn't really describe yoga in that more medical or therapeutic way. It's really more contemplative, soteriological. It's more of a meditative practice in general. But over time, though, especially with the rise of Hatha Yoga and other influences, there is more emphasis on the body and its cultivation and the use of mudras and asana and these physical practices, right, that are used according to the text to target particular ailments in the body and so forth. But that does seem to be a change over time within the yoga traditions.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we do have, Christelle Barrois' research has shown us that there is some early reference to health in yoga context. Her work on the text called the Dharma Putrika, which is part of the Shiva Dharma corpus, and which she thinks might be really quite early, just after the Patanjala Yoga Shastra. And that text has quite a lot to say about getting ill through yoga practice, which in the case of the Dharma Putrika means breathing exercises and contemplation practices, but breathing exercises are a big part of it. And these practices in that text are described as causing some disease symptoms. And it gives you a clue on where you are in your practice. But at the same time, the text then also offers other breathing practices to counteract the illnesses that arise through your yoga practice. And so I think this is probably our earliest example of the idea of establishing health, but actually first establishing disease through yogic practice. It's a bit of an outlier. I mean, breath control, of course, is very important very quickly in yoga, but the sort of combination of breathing and health, that's sort of a very early example of that. And asana practice, of course, as we know, really only developed quite late. This focus on postural practices is a sort of later development in yoga history. So therefore, also the connection with health and posture is also late.
So let's step back just for a second. We're kind of diving into the weeds of yoga and Ayurveda, but for our listeners, for our viewers, give us a very brief introduction to Ayurveda. What is Ayurveda? And what are the goals of this tradition? Because I'm also thinking, are there, complementary goals and aims between yoga and Ayurveda?
Yeah, yes, there are, briefly. So obviously, Ayurveda has a really long history, a good 2,000 years, actually longer, and very difficult to sort of say this in a few sentences. But one of the things I'll talk about in the lecture as well is when the oldest treatises talk about, what is medicine for, it's in order to prolong life. So you're making the patient healthy so that they can live longer and live healthily. So health is in a way a little bit secondary. What you want to do is give people a long life. And the reason is that they can then pursue the Chaturvarga, the 4 goals of life. And those are familiar to all of us who, have some, knowledge about Indic thought. The Chaturvarga are the pursuit of pleasure, kama, artha, wealth, and dharma, righteousness, but also sort of religious duty, and moksha, or liberation, spiritual emancipation. And so in the earliest of the Ayurvedic treatises, the Charaka Samhita, the compendium or collection of Charaka, this is stated outright that this intervention into health is so that people can pursue these 4 goals in life. And dharma, righteousness, religious duty is given pride of place. Moksha is there, but maybe not discussed at great length in the treatises. But
I was
nevertheless,
going to ask about that. Sometimes there's just the 3 goals, right, in some of the earlier literature, and moksha is almost secondary or an afterthought.
Yeah, so what we can see is that the 3 goals are mentioned quite often. So you find them referred to a number of times, whereas the moksha is sort of like it's in that quote that I was just sort of paraphrasing right there. So it's clearly not of quite as strong interest to the medical practitioner as are the other 3 goals. So they're a little bit more interested in the more mundane goals about life now. But it's supposed to be the good life, it's supposed to be the dharmic life. And I think this idea of dharma is, of course, interpreted differently depending on your religious community and differently over time and so on. But this sort of spiritual goals, spiritual duty, religious duty is something that the Ayurvedic treatises deal with quite a lot.
So Ayurveda is a system of Indian medicine that has a particular view of the human and the world that one would practice, right? Not just read about, but to practice, to implement in order to achieve the ultimate human life and experience in this world, in this very life.
Exactly. I mean, moksha is sort of, that's aside from that, that would be like an extra step, right? That's not in this life.
Yeah, maybe that's the yoga.
Maybe that's the yoga. Yes. So, yeah, I think, one of the differences between yoga and Ayurveda is that in Ayurveda, there's a trained physician who's intervening between you and these goals, right? So you have the patient, and the physician acts on behalf of the patient when their roles are complementary. But, so it's the physician doing something for the patient so that the patient can experience karma and dharma and artha, whereas, of course, in the yoga texts, the yogi is the practitioner, it's doing it for himself or herself. So, it's not really so much this other person who is the recipient of the, the outcomes of the knowledge, as it were. So that's a pretty big difference. However, in the medical text, the physician helps the patient with a long life and so on, but obviously is also supposed to follow these precepts himself, herself, he's also going to pursue dharma, and he's going to pursue karma and artha. As a physician is always at the same time also a patient. And indeed, in Ayurvedic mythology, we're sort of talking about how does Ayurvedic knowledge come to us, and it's via the gods, through the sages, through the Vedic sages, the rishis, who then teach the more normal humans. But the sages need this knowledge because they've become ill in this sort of Ayurvedic mythology. They've had sort of city living, and they've become a little bit ill because of it, too comfortable life and so on. And now they need to treat themselves and become healthy again to pursue their spiritual goals and to pursue their religious duties as sages. Right. And so they're sort of the proto-patient and the proto-physician at the same time. They're the first humans who do this practice. And so for me, these rishis are like the yogis. They're doing interventions, first of all, for themselves. And then out of compassion with humanity, they teach humanity, they train physicians who then can treat others. So there's a sort of connection there, I think, in this mythology with yogic thought as well.
Wonderful. No, one thing I wanted to ask you, and then I think we'll move on to another topic. But as someone who's working closely with the medieval yoga literature, I'm kind of constantly thinking of authorship and who's writing these texts and for whom, the audience, and thinking about this connection between the literary traditions, the Sanskrit textual traditions, as well as vernacular, but then with the actual kind of on-the-ground yogi practitioner communities. So within Ayurveda and perhaps alchemy, which we'll get to, it seems to be a little bit different, or maybe more clear-cut, that these texts really were written or codified. Maybe this knowledge was transmitted in ways that are beyond us, but eventually they were transmitted by humans, codified, written in manuscript form. But were they meant really to be like textbooks, to be studied? Were these texts, systematized and institutionalized from an early period? And then do we know about the history of the ways that these texts were actually used and practiced to put into an Ayurvedic practice?
Yes, we know some things and other things we don't know. But for example, so I would see this literature, the early ones, they're really about defining the medical profession, to sort of show that medicine is a shastra, authoritative knowledge. The practitioners are respectable members of society, and they have access through, formalized learning to this specific shastric knowledge. This is also the case for alchemical literature. So they spend quite a lot of time sort of saying, what are the professional ethics, what are the standards of practice, and what does this practice look like? And it's all about sort of establishing it as a learned profession as a authoritative knowledge. And I think that's a little bit different to many of the medieval yoga texts, especially. But in the earliest treatises, for example, there's this description of how to learn Ayurveda, and their texts are mentioned. And the student is supposed to choose good texts, and the good texts are defined by how well they're structured, how clear they are. Do they give all the information that is needed? And then, how does the physician develop his skill? I keep on saying his because it's always men that are mentioned nowadays. Of course, we have a lot of female practitioners, so the gender thing has changed over time. But so then you have this sort of professional training of physicians, and so the earliest texts mention texts being used and what are the criteria for knowing which text is good and which text is authoritative and so on. And it shows a training process that uses texts. So, we have this sense of, a professional group that has particular tools at their hand. We know of pupillage, that a teacher will teach a pupil, but then they're also using this literature for their training. And so this is mentioned in the earliest treatises and also in some of the later ones. Yeah, sorry, does that answer your question?
Yeah. In brief, I know there's much more, I'm sure, and I imagine. I mean, is there any information we have from any epigraphical inscriptions or any material culture? I'm also wondering, or archaeological things about Ayurvedic mattas. I'm not sure if that's even the proper word for it, but the institutionalization, I'm wondering, and even the communities and physicality of these traditions.
So we don't have, we in the text we hear only about pupillage. So one teacher, one pupil, or maybe a few pupils who live with him. So, it's like a guru-shishya sort of relationship, right? So you don't have like schools with 40 students or something. We don't have any description of that. As for inscriptions, we don't have any inscriptions that tell us of any such schools or universities. What we do have is some inscriptions that relate to the payment for physicians. They get paid in foods, and maybe their job is paid for by a temple complex and so on. So that's something that the texts don't tell us anything about.
So we have the receipts.
We have the receipt, as it were. And that physician got 2 bags of rice and a bit of land, and that sort of thing. So we have a little bit of evidence there. There's archaeological evidence maybe for a space in which patients were treated that's connected with Buddhist monasteries. So, that was sort of like early kinds of hospitals, as it were, but nothing on the training, basically, of physicians in a university context. And we know there were universities in India. The Buddhist universities, the famous ones, but none of them speak of medical training as such. It seems to be, even from the Buddhist text itself, it seems that people would have had their medical training before they became monks or nuns, and then they can apply this knowledge. But there doesn't seem to have been a program of training them as physicians when they were already ordained. And so for Hindu contexts, we also don't have any evidence of sort of larger school trainings until the 19th century, in the context of actually colonization, which had a very negative impact on pupillage, on sort of schooling, traditional schools in the first place, and then tried to replace these things with more formalized schools on the European model. And then in the 20th century, we get this institutionalization of Ayurveda. And then, the structures as we have them now, universities, colleges, and so on, where people can learn the practice and the theory of Ayurveda in quite long university courses, 4 years, 5 years courses to get, a bachelor degree. And then you can do additional degrees as well.
All right. So we've spoken in some detail now about yoga and Ayurveda. But our third discipline here, and what we'll be looking at in the course, is the Indian alchemical traditions, which perhaps is less familiar to listeners, to students, certainly to myself. So tell us a little bit, give us a brief introduction to Indian alchemy, and why is this important to consider alongside yoga and Ayurveda?
Yeah, so my starting point there was, Indian alchemy or Rasaśāstra as part of Ayurveda or as complementary to Ayurveda, because this tradition has a lot of medicine in it and influenced Ayurvedic medicine. And so I sort of saw it as a sort of a package deal, as it were, with Ayurveda. So, if you know about Ayurveda, you actually probably know a little bit about, Indian alchemy without realizing it. Anything that's to do with metals and minerals, poisonous substances within Ayurveda, it's probably come from alchemy, from the alchemical tradition. So we have, as a literary tradition, alchemy develops sort of around the 10th century, maybe a little bit earlier. You know how dates for things is always a little bit difficult to come by, and alchemy is no different. And these first texts don't describe medicine. They describe making elixirs based on mercury and other materials. And these elixirs are used for elixir regimen called Rasaśāstra. And the outcomes of these regimens are things that yogis were very familiar with, because it's things like Jivan Mukti, the liberation while still living. So we have a sort of shared vocabulary. There's also the idea of entering a godlike state, become like Shiva, enter Brahmapada. So there's clear connections with sort of yogic goals with the early alchemical texts, sort of mercurial tradition. So then instead of, having meditation, you instead, pop a pill more or less over a great amount of time. You make the materials, and then you take them over a certain period of time.
Shortcut to nirvana.
Well,
in fact, Patanjali himself in the Yoga Shastra mentions that one of the other ways to attain the siddhis is through aushadhi, or herbs. In the Bhashya goes on. Philip Moss has written a bit about this. Yeah.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Actually, in a volume that I edited, it was part of my project. He came to that workshop and talked about this. Yeah. So it's sort of the idea of Rasaśāstra. This is different from the Rasaśāstra. Already is there in the medical tradition. It's one of the 8 subject areas of Ayurvedic medicine. It's sort of vitalization therapies, pro-longevity therapies, and so on, rejuvenation. It's called Rasaśāstra. And the elixir regimen of Indian alchemy is also called Rasaśāstra. And so the people mix them up a little bit. They are very strongly connected, the difference being that the alchemical ones all use mercury, whereas the medical ones don't, at least not until Ayurveda meets alchemy, as it were. The ones in the Patanjali, yeah.
Oh, I was going to finish your thought, and then I'll ask.
They're just thinking in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, the Rasaśāstra that is mentioned there and is sort of described in the Bhashya part, it describes something even a little bit different. Again, it's the use of herbs, so non-alchemical Rasaśāstra. But there's also this whole sort of meeting supernatural beings and being in sort of different dimensions and so on when you take that. And that, connects slightly with the medical tradition and connects slightly with the alchemical tradition, but maybe actually describes a third thing, something that is sort of around in Indic thought more broadly. However, later medieval yoga texts also describe the taking of pills for enhancing meditation and for, again, reaching the same goals as the alchemists, as the yogic goals, but again, enhanced or made easier or supported by alchemical products.
So you're saying the cannabis yoga class today has a historical precedent in this literature.
Well, cannabis certainly has a long history of use within yogic circles, and actually Patricia Sveltov is doing quite a lot of work on that, as is James Mallinson. So I think
I saw Patricia recently at the conference in Krakow, and she gave a presentation on this. It was a very interesting and entertaining presentation. Okay, so you mentioned mercury within Indian alchemy. Why is mercury so important within Indian alchemy?
This is a really difficult question to answer. We have things, doctrines that could be considered alchemy beforehand, and we hear about it. It doesn't have a literature. It's sort of mentioned in other literatures, narrative literatures, Buddhist texts, and so on. And these traditions are called Dhatu Vada. Vada is the doctrine, and then Dhatu is metals, probably in this, or the doctrine of metals. And the guys who were Dhatu Vadins, whose doctrine was that of the Dhatus, were metallurgists, but they were trying to make gold. And so we have this as their their aim. But it's always people from the outside describing this, and it's often satirized. And so these delusional people who are trying to make gold. And sometimes it's shown, no, they can do it. Just like cities are described, yes, he can fly. Yes, he can make gold. That sort of description, but there's no literature attached to this. And then suddenly we get this new literature, this Rasaśāstra or Rasavada literature. So again, Vada, doctrine, and Rasa, mercury. Rasa can also be translated as essence. So it doesn't have to be mercury. But when you read the actual text, you can see that Rasa is usually used in the sense of mercury. And it's really not clear at all why suddenly mercury becomes so important, because in all the descriptions before, it's not there. Mercury is not used. Other materials are used, but really iron, for example, is used, but not copper, but not mercury. And mercury doesn't occur on the Indian subcontinent. So, you have it a little bit in Afghanistan, and then the next place you get it is in Tibet, in China. Right. So it had to be imported probably, though the texts say, there's various places where you can get it from, and maybe it's just a matter of amounts, but there's no mines or so where you can get mercury in India, or mercury sulfide, cinnabar, no cinnabar in India. So it's really surprising that suddenly there's this whole tradition that's completely based on the use of mercury and mercury sulfides. And so, the idea is that maybe it was imported from China, which had a long-standing alchemical tradition and had been using cinnabar, especially, but also liquid mercury, and that maybe there's some sort of transfer there. There's also, maybe the other area it could have come from would be from sort of jewelry making. So mercury is used in gold plating, for example. So there may have been some knowledge of mercury from that area of knowledge. But it's still very unclear why they suddenly all begin using mercury. And mercury is then associated with Shiva, and so it's really integrated into Shaiva thought, into Indic religiosity, and the texts themselves. There's nothing where you would say, oh, that's foreign. That sounds like something Chinese or so. It really sounds Indic. It makes sense in itself, the way things are described and so on. So it's just that it's surprising because this material itself is not there.
Yeah, I remember, David Gordon White in his book Alchemical Body, he speaks a lot about not yogis eating mercury. Is this something that you've encountered, either in the literature or in your, own experience in India? Typically, the mercury is used in some sort of alchemical transfiguration, right?
Yeah, so you make a pill which is really complicated to make, and then you take that pill, and that helps you to have this sort of experience of transcendence, or to develop siddhis, or to enhance your meditation. But no, so I myself have not seen yogis in India take these pills. James Mallinson once told me that his guru would take mercury preparations for rejuvenation purposes. He would have some sort of Rasayana practices. What they were exactly, Jim wouldn't tell, or didn't know. I don't know. Probably wouldn't tell. It's maybe something that's sort of part of secret knowledge, where you have to be initiated to hear more about it. Certainly in the text, the Kechari Vidya, for example, describes taking pills in the 4th chapter. We have the translation by James Mallinson of this. So there, the actual recipes, like the ingredients for the pills there, could be straight from an alchemical text. So, so they're using these, these are yogis using this. The thing is that chapter actually goes back to an older tantric text, and I'm probably going to get it wrong now, but it's, I think, the Matsyendra Samhita or so. So that's where that chapter actually is from. So then it's sort of a question about who do you call a yogi, right? And so in the alchemical text, the practitioner is often called sadhaka, like, in tantric text, and sometimes they're also called yogi. So, might have been the same people. When it comes to nats, a lot of the same authorities, the siddhas are mentioned in alchemical texts, where you have the same names in yoga texts, the same names in Vajrayana texts. So, there's a sort of shared, group of authorities for all these traditions. But we also have Persian accounts of Nats using mercurials for their practices. So we have sort of outsider reports in medieval times about the Nats in particular being associated with using mercury for various purposes.
Yeah, this sort of reminds me of David Gordon White's book, The Alchemical Body, which he wrote in 1996, and at the time was truly groundbreaking work. Really, opening up the floodgates in many ways of these disciplines and in how to think together about them, with opening up a whole huge body of material that hadn't really been critically looked at by very many South Asianists or Indologists. But I think there's also some problems now with that book, and it was written over 25 years ago. So of course we would think that we would improve our understanding of these texts and traditions in that time. I'm sure David White himself has revised many of his ideas in that span. So I don't mean to pick on it, but sometimes his work does get picked on quite a bit. But nonetheless, if one picks up that book today, I recall kind of walking away from it with the overarching feeling that David White is putting forth this argument that the what he calls the rasa siddhas, so the alchemical siddhas or adepts, the yogis, the not yogis, and the Ayurvedic physicians are sort of one and the same. That this is
the Ayurvedic physicians, no, the Ayurvedic physicians are sort of not really part of that narrative. He does say that alchemy becomes medicalized. So you have you have alchemy, and then part of it goes into yoga and sort of drops the whole sort of elixir thing, and the other part becomes medical and becomes Ayurveda. So it's like two strands that develop from there, and that's the thing that he puts forward in his idea. I think one of the main ideas is that he says, basically that these alchemists were poisoning themselves, and therefore they kind of then internalize the practices and become yogis. So you have a transition from alchemist to yogi, and I think that is a little bit problematic as a sort of theory, sort of that, because alchemists continue to be alchemists as well. We have texts, 18th, 19th, 20th century, where they're still making mercurial elixirs, not for medical purposes, but for yogic purposes as well. So that's the one thing that I think that doesn't quite stand the scrutiny of time, I would say. But I myself use his book a lot, and it's got a lot of information that I find really, really useful. He covered so much ground.
So much ground.
In it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so let's look ahead now at this course that you're going to teach for us here at Yogic Studies, YS 121, Ayurveda, Yoga, and Alchemy. We've spoken a lot already about all of these different topics, and of course, you can't give everything away because we want people still to take the course. But why don't you give us just a little bit of a preview and an overview, maybe of the structure of the course and sort of what students can expect?
Sure. So in thinking about what I wanted to teach in the course, the one thing I'm a little bit uncertain of is, who is my audience? How much do they know beforehand? And I don't know. And therefore, I'm going to start a little bit at zero for all the topics. So what I'll do is we have 4 classes, 90 minutes each. And I'll start with Ayurveda. I'll start with the history of Ayurveda. And I'll be talking a lot about, literature, but also some of the main concepts. And the main concepts are important to mention because then we'll find, are they or are they not mentioned in yoga contexts and so on. So we'll talk a bit about that. We'll look at, how is Ayurveda described in pre-modern context? What does it look like now? And then in the next class, I'll be looking more specifically at the interactions of Ayurveda and yoga. So what do Ayurvedic texts say about yoga, and what do yoga texts say about Ayurveda, and what, how has that developed into the whole sister science thing of today? That will happen in the second module. So it's all about health and establishing health and well-being and so on. The third one will be about Rasaśāstra or Rasavada, so the Indian alchemical tradition. And that's going to be really about the basics. What is this tradition? Because I'm really assuming that people won't know a whole lot about that. If they have read The Alchemical Body by David White, that's a great start. But I'm going to be talking about a lot of the sort of more technical aspects of the tradition, because that's sort of where the interactions happen a lot between Ayurveda and alchemy, and later also yoga and alchemy. So I'll just give a sort of broad introduction to that in the third class. And then the fourth one will bring all the threads together and look at an area of commonality between all three disciplines, namely these Rasayana practice, these sort of pro-longevity, vitality practices that are shared by all three to a certain extent, and we'll sort of look into the history of that and basically what became of it. And so that will be the four classes of this course.
Wonderful. That sounds fantastic. I can't wait to watch the recordings of these lectures. I think we're having you teach it at a fortunate time at the end of this 5-year research project. So you've had so much time to really digest and try to make sense of all this material that you'll now do the impossible task of compressing into 4 easy lectures for us, for our enjoyment and appetite. And that's wonderful. Who do you think might benefit or be most interested in a course like this? And what do you hope that students will take away from this material?
Yeah, so I'm sort of trying to make it accessible to a broad public. Anybody who's interested in yoga and Ayurveda, and hopefully soon in alchemy. So it should be something that is accessible to a broad audience. Anybody interested in Indian history, in Indian culture, in Hinduism, in Buddhism a little bit. So it's a broad Indic theme, but also people who are interested in, what pre-modern India had to say about health, establishing health, why we want health, how do we attain it, and so on. And so the various answers given to this question. What I won't do, and I think it does need saying, I'm not a practitioner of Ayurveda, I'm not a practitioner of alchemy, so I won't be giving people DIY tips, to how to practice Ayurveda, but I will sort of talk about, sort of some ideas and some recipes and so on, just to sort of give people an idea what it feels like, perhaps, as a practice. So I think it should be sort of a broad interest to students, and especially, I think you have a certain audience with yogic studies, so I'm hoping that this will, you were saying that, a lot of people asked for a yoga and Ayurveda course, yes. So I'm hoping that I will, fulfill some of their wishes.
Now,
and
you just said, you're not a practitioner of it, and this won't be a DIY course. And yet I do know, though, that you do have a DIY nature about some of your research. You have produced some of these experimental videos with taking these recipes from the classical literature and actually enacting them. Is that right? Can you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so these were historical reconstructions, right, of recipes that are not used anymore today, but that are described in the oldest of the alchemical treatises. And I was working with an actual Ayurvedic practitioner who had a specialized training in modern medicalized Rasaśāstra, so the sort of iatrochemistry, Indian alchemy, and we were reconstructing recipes. I was translating, and he was doing the procedures. But there's one step that we didn't do, namely apply the elixir to a patient for health and safety reasons. So there's sort of limits to what we were doing there. But it was really just to reconstruct, what did this practice look like? What was the visual impact? How would an alchemist spend his day? What were the materials they were working with, and so on. So I think that comes across quite nicely, but it's historical reconstruction rather than, I wasn't trying to be an alchemist, or Andrew was trying to sort of say, can we understand the text? Can the text be used as a manual? What was the reason the texts were written in a way, like can you follow their descriptions and so on? And so these are things that we could answer through our experimentation. So it's a little bit different from showing people how to, in a way, it's just sort of give a little bit of a visual idea of what this was like.
But you recorded a series of videos, right?
That's right. Yeah. And you can see them all. So my project has a website, Ayuryog.org. So Ayur plus yog, just in one word, .org. And you can see the alchemy reconstructions videos on there. But we also have a dedicated YouTube channel. It's also called Ayuryog. And you can find all the videos we made. And then there's also accompanying blog posts that sort of explain what we're doing and what the issues were that arose when we did these documentaries, just to sort of enhance the understanding of the processes. So you can watch all the videos on our YouTube channel as well. But I think the website is probably a good starting point to sort of see all the materials and get a bit more explanation of what we were doing with these with these experiments.
Yeah, and we'll certainly link to those websites in the podcast show notes and in the YouTube description below. But I do want to encourage folks to go check that out because there's so many great resources on the ayuryog.org site, including these really remarkable digital timelines that Dagmar and her team put together, detailing the history of these traditions in a very dynamic, interactive way. Do you want to say anything about these timelines?
Well, one is about the interactions of yoga and Ayurveda. So that's really relevant to the course that I'll be teaching here, and I'll be using it for the course, for teaching the course. And the other one is a timeline of alchemical literature. And there it was really just about sort of just establishing, people's knowledge in the first place. Look, there is this literature. It starts in the 10th century, somewhere around that time, and goes up to the present and so on, just to give people sort of insight into what this literature looks like. So I think that's that one I won't use directly for my course, but I will certainly be linking to it so that people can look at it in their own time to get a sort of impression of what kinds of things alchemists were writing.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dagmar. As we wrap up here, any final thoughts or reflections or anything you didn't get to say today that you were hoping to?
Oh, I don't know, but hoping to. I think one of the things I'm looking forward to is the Q&A session. I was saying how I didn't quite know who the audience were. And so I'm not quite sure, who I'm directing my lectures at. And so in the Q&A session, we will have this great opportunity to talk with each other and to sort of, fine tune the materials a bit, see what, things that maybe people were very interested in that I couldn't quite talk enough about in the lectures and so on. We can catch up on that and so on, and they can ask the questions. So I think the Q&A sessions will be really interesting in this course and, help me formulate my thoughts more for this course.
Absolutely. And we have a very diverse community of students from, of course, all over the world because we're online, but also from really different backgrounds. From within, yoga practitioner communities, I think for this course, Ayurvedic practitioner communities, academics, non-academics, dentists, lawyers, you name it, everyone is welcome. So please, if you're interested in these topics and want to dive deeper into Ayurveda, yoga, and alchemy, join us. The course runs live from August 15th through September 9th, 2022. At the time that this is airing, enrollment should be open for this course. But of course, if you're watching this in the future, then everything's already been recorded and you can still sign up and access all of these wonderful lectures and materials. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, for watching, for listening. And thank you, of course, to our wonderful guest, Dr. Dagmar Wujastyk. Looking forward to the course, and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks, everyone. Please take care.